Memories. When I was younger, I took a job at a deli that had what the owner called an ice cream buffet. On Thursdays, children would get a free ice cream cone with their meals, and they could pick any one of the 15 flavors we had. There were many times when a child had some understandable degree of difficulty selecting their preferred scoop, but eventually each kid would happily make their choice when the mom or dad urged them along, except, that is, for one little girl. She couldn't have been more than 6, and when her father picked her up so that she could see through the glass, her face lit up as her eyes moved over all the different kinds of ice cream that were on display. When her dad asked her which flavor she wanted, she must have ignored the fact that he was not speaking about a plurality of scoops, and she excitedly named some and pointed to others. Gradually, the realization began to set in that she could only choose one kind of ice cream, and as I watched her try to pick just one flavor, I could see how anxious she was becoming. It wasn't greed that beset her, it was the result of wanting many things equally but not having the emotional resources to settle arbitrarily on just one. As the anxiety consumed her, she began to cry. There was no tantrum. She didn't yell or pout. She simply could not choose. As her father was comforting her, I caught his eye and made a gesture. He nodded, and after a few seconds I leaned over the counter and called to her as I extended my hand. The little girl looked up to see me holding a cone towering with 5 different scoops of ice cream. Her mood was transformed instantly, and I can say with all sincerity that I have never seen another human being in such a state of pure jubilation. The father thanked me and saw to it that the girl did as well. They left, and we all moved on with our lives. That was years ago, though my mind returns to that day for different reasons now and again. Most of the time I just think about how happy she was, but sometimes I think about how, despite her seemingly limitless joy that day, in all likelihood she probably doesn't remember me or the ice cream. This doesn't bother me. As children we have terrific and terrible times, events that, as we experience them, seem to be the most important things that have ever happened to us, but more often than not we forget them. Truth to tell, at any point in our lives we've forgotten more than we know about our own history. The world moves on, and so do we, and what was once important fades away. But that's just the nature of memory. The events of our lives unfold linearly, but in the mental reel of these past experiences, most of the frames that haven't been completely stolen by time are left distorted and blurred by it. When you try to reconstruct the series, you find that it isn't complete, but maybe this never really bothers you, because you can't miss what you don't remember. We all have voids in our narratives, lost time that we attempt to reclaim with best guesses. Most people have whole parts of their stories that they don't realize are patchworks of guesswork, and those who do realize it aren't likely to care. We want so badly to be happy, to live the kinds of lives that we always hoped we'd live, that we give gifts to ourselves by remembering things not as they were, but as we wish they were. Our loved ones pass away or simply leave our lives forever too soon. And we think to ourselves, I wasn't ready for you to leave. It just wasn't time, because we're never truly ready, because it's never truly time. So we keep them in our memories. And when we regret that we don't have more memories of them, maybe our minds give us more gifts, gradually we find ourselves remembering them being with us in times and places that they couldn't have been, and gradually we stop correcting ourselves because, well, we want them to have been there. Some memories slip away through the cracks of our minds, but leave fibers behind so that we know there's something missing. But this isn't all bad. In fact, if we remembered every detail of every day, we might find ourselves so fixated on the past that most of our memories would be of us just sitting in a dark room thinking about all of our yesterdays, too focused on what was to care at all about what will be. And what of bad things? What of those things that we would wish had never happened if we could remember them? Sometimes forgetting is the gift that we give ourselves, and when we do, it's back to the void, and it's time for more guesses toward a better life. But sometimes you realize that the memories were always there, you just needed to be reminded. When this happens, it offers a previously lacked context for memories that, while never missing, were never understood. This is a special kind of gift. Our lives are so short that it seems a crime to squander any of it by forgetting. Memories extend our lives backward through time, making them feel longer. And that's what we want. So we try to remember. But sometimes, when we do, we wish that we could just forget again. But I remember. The story that I'm about to tell you is the product of my own mental archaeology. Of course, like all great digs, how the artifacts fit together in a timeline is about as immediately clear as which things are important and which are not. Some parts of this story I have always remembered. Others were buried deeply, and some I simply never knew about and have only recently discovered. As is often the case, remembering one thing helps you remember another, and as you learn new things about your old life, memories that you thought were insignificant, or at the very least irrelevant, parts of your overall story are suddenly its foundation. I began reconstructing and transcribing parts of this story on my own. And when I eventually and inevitably had questions, I turned to the only other person who could claim any amount of expertise concerning my history, my mother. Over the course of several weeks, my mother and I had a series of increasingly strained conversations, and it was through these talks that the importance of some forgotten, ignored, or never-known childhood events became clear. Looking back, these events all seem to fit so squarely that I can hardly believe they required reassembly at all. But what we notice in our lives, particularly as children, is so extraordinarily selective and contextualized that something ostensibly benign or self-contained can be transformed, by a single detail, into something terrible and pervasive. You just have to know what you're looking for, and when you do, suddenly it's all you can see. Here, I've tried to preserve both my thoughts and experiences of my early life, as well as the gradual influx of new information, so that you might learn of these events as I experienced them. Parts of this story were written before I knew what I now know, all of which you will know by the end of this story, but I've kept the chapters as they were originally written. To the best of my ability, I have avoided contaminating my old memories with new revelations, and I've tried to be as faithful to the past as was possible when extrapolating from my earliest memories. What I offer you here is a combination of what I remember, what I've learned about my past from my mother, and what seems most likely, though my guesswork was restricted to gaps that are ultimately unimportant. If I was successful in all of this, then you will understand now as I understood then, and the pieces of my history will fall into place for you in very much the same way that they have only recently done for me. Now begin in the middle, and later learn the beginning, the end will take care of itself. By Harlan Ellison. Chapter 2, Footsteps. In a quiet room, if you press your ear against a pillow, you can hear your heartbeat. As a 6-year-old boy, the muffled, rhythmic beats sounded like soft footsteps on a carpeted floor, and so as a kid, almost every night, just as I was about to drift off to sleep, I would hear these footsteps and I would be ripped back to consciousness, terrified. For my entire childhood, I lived with my mother in a fairly nice, and extremely rural, neighborhood that was in a transitional phase. People of lower economic means were gradually moving in. My mother and I were two of these people. Those that spend any amount of time driving on interstate highways will see half-houses traveling alongside them. It's an odd sight if you let yourself think about it, two halves of a house built somewhere miles away from where it becomes a home. Everything about those structures has a feeling of impermanence. The wood that forms them is cut where it isn't used and assembled where it doesn't stay. The most permanent things about those houses are the concrete support columns that they rest on, but even those seem transitory in a way. My mother and I lived in one of these houses, but she took good care of it. As a kid, I always thought our house was quite nice. As I sit here and think about my old home and all the things in it, an amusing and pleasant conflict builds in my mind. I know now that we were poor, but had you asked me then, I would have had no idea what could have prompted that question. My mother must have had so little money to spend, but I never remember her saying the words that tend to become the mantra of some parents when they try to subdue their children's eager shopping: "We can't afford it." I don't remember wanting for much. I even had a bunk bed despite being an only child. I'm sure that this is the case for many children in low-income homes, but as a boy, despite the incongruity, I thought my home was as close to a palace as one could hope for. To me, the support columns under the house didn't represent what the house actually was, an imported structure on a makeshift foundation, but what it could be. I remember asking my mother if we could make the columns taller so our house would tower over all the others. Part of my love for the house stemmed from my general love for the area surrounding it. The neighborhood itself was relatively large in proportion to the town itself. Small towns lack many of the luxuries of larger towns or cities. What few stores there are close down early. Traveling events don't stop there because they probably missed your small dot on the map, and there aren't many police or hospitals at your disposal. But, to a kid, these things don't matter because small towns often provide a luxury that can't be found in larger, more convenient or populated places: freedom. Of course, I had rules to follow. I had a lot of them, in fact. But I didn't notice any of them restricting me because I was allowed to do the one thing a kid in a relatively remote area likes to do: explore. Just a short walk from my back porch was a dense and untamed wilderness that I spent some part of nearly every day surveying. These woods and waterways surrounding the neighborhood were my playground during the day. But at night, as things often do in the mind of a child, they would take on a more sinister feeling. The apparent change in the very nature of the trees and the lake, I think, was mostly my fault. One of my mother's rules was that I could explore the woods on the condition that I would be home before dark. To motivate my speedy return, I would play games in my mind when leaving the woods at dusk. My feet moved more quickly when I imagined that they were carrying me away from ghouls and beasts. When I would dream, the footsteps would belong to these pursuers. Sometimes I'd pretend that a hideous and ravenous wolf was charging through the woods just behind me. I'd imagine what would happen if I stumbled or fell and it caught up with me, but when I concentrated too hard on keeping my balance, it would always seem to ensure that I lost it. Other times I'd convince myself that there was an enormous clutter of spiders descending from the trees above and blanketing the earth behind, and that I was always inches away from being ensnared in a collective web or simply overwhelmed by their numbers and tackled by the sheer weight of their individually weightless bodies. The thing I imagined the most, I think, was that if I didn't make it home before the sun went down, my mother would be gone, that everyone would be gone, and that I'd be all alone. I always made it back home the quickest when I played that game. It didn't take long for these games to become a reflex, and the fear would appear without any effort at all. Some nights I would spill into the house so frantically that it would startle my mother, but this was the winter of the first grade of elementary school, so I tried to compose myself and pretend that I was merely worried about getting home too late. The things I imagined in the woods just before nightfall created a feeling of general uneasiness in me when the sun retired. My home offered refuge from these terrors, but the architecture of my house came to sabotage my feelings of security. The concrete stilts that raised my house above the earth left a void just below the entirety of the floor of my home. Gradually, my mind came to fill this crawlspace with imaginary monsters and inescapable scenarios, and they would consume my thoughts whenever I was awoken by the footsteps. I told my mom about the footsteps, and she said that I was just imagining things. This seemed an appropriate accusation given my tactics for making curfew, but I persisted enough that she blasted my ears with water from a turkey baster once just to placate me, since I insisted that it would help. Of course, it didn't. The footsteps continued that night, but I tried my best to ignore them, just like always. Despite the general eeriness that the games and footsteps would cast over the nighttime neighborhood, my life was a quiet one. I had adventures by myself, or, more often, with my best friend Josh, but I suppose every kid has their adventures. The only odd or noteworthy events that I can remember happening were the occasions when I would wake up on the bottom bunk despite having gone to sleep on the top. This would only happen every now and again, but it wasn't really that strange since I'd sometimes get up to use the bathroom or get something to drink and could remember just going back to sleep on the bottom bunk. This would happen frequently enough to remember but infrequently enough to dismiss. In itself, waking up on the bottom bunk never really bothered me. But one night, toward the end of winter in first grade, I didn't wake up on the bottom bunk. I had heard the footsteps but was too far gone to be woken up by them. When I awoke, it wasn't from the sound of footsteps, but the feeling of biting cold and violent shivering. As I opened my eyes, the clashing of what I expected to see, what I had nearly always seen when I woke up in a place other than the top bunk, and what I actually saw, frustrated my senses as my mind tried to reconcile my expectations with actuality. I saw, or rather my mind showed me, the red, cylindrical bars that supported the mattress of the top bunk, but beyond those, I saw stars. Gradually, the bars melted away and faded from my vision, and I was left with only those floating points of light and the jagged, crossing limbs of the tall trees that arched across them high up in the sky. I was in the woods. I shouldn't be here, I thought. The coupling of the woods with darkness was something I had trained myself to avoid. I sat up immediately and tried to make sense of where I was. I thought I was dreaming, but that didn't seem right, though neither did me being in the woods. My eyes were slowly adjusting to the limited light, and gradually the trunks of trees and the shapes of overgrown bushes began to take form. I scanned over the foliage without really focusing on any of it as I searched for something I might recognize, something that might give me some indication of where I was. An unnatural shape caught my eyes, and I looked at it for what felt like a very long time until I could finally discern what it was. About 10 feet in front of me, resting among a mass of tangled sticks and loose leaves, there was a deflated pool float that was shaped like a shark. Even after I understood what it was, I continued looking at it, trying to figure out why it was there. This only added to the surreal feeling, to the point that I was sure that I must be experiencing a dream rather than the world itself. After a while, though, it seemed like I just wasn't going to wake up, because I wasn't asleep. I stood up to orient myself, and I caught a flash of some trampled shrubs that looked like a path, but the woods were thick behind it, so I turned to look elsewhere. I didn't recognize this place. I played in the woods by my house all the time, and so I knew them really well, but I had only been in them when it was dark once before. I had run through my woods straight to my house at the last edge of dusk countless times without even having to think about how to get there. But there's a big difference between dusk and dark, and as I stood there taking in all that there was to see in the dim light, it started to creep into my mind much more forcefully that these might not be my woods after all. A shiver that I think was only partially due to the chilled air ran through me as I wondered how someone was supposed to find his way to a place when he didn't know where he was starting. I took a deep breath and a single step and felt a shooting pain in my foot. I lifted my leg quickly and reeled off balance, falling back to where I had woken up only moments ago. I moved my eyes from the terrain to my throbbing foot and saw what had felled me. I had stepped on a thorn. It stuck about an inch out of the middle of my foot, but it only bled when I quickly tore it out of my skin. I wound my arm back to throw it someplace where it wouldn't pose a danger to me any longer, but as I searched for a safe spot, I realized that there wasn't one. By the light of the moon, I could see that the thorns were everywhere. The whole ground was laced with this natural barbed wire. I had been lucky to only step on a single thorn just then, but as this occurred to me, I became conscious of the rest of my body. I looked at my other foot, but it was fine. As a matter of fact, so was the rest of me. I searched over my legs and feet with my eyes and hands. No cuts. No scrapes. I didn't have another scratch on me. I wasn't even that dirty. I cried for a little bit and then stood back up. I opened my mouth and filled my 6-year-old lungs to capacity, and just as I was about to scream for help, my breath hitched in my throat as a thought lodged itself powerfully in my mind. What if someone heard me? I held the air tightly in my chest and stood puzzled by my own question. I needed help, shouldn't I hope that someone would hear me? All at once, I began to think of the fiends and monsters that I had imagined stalking and chasing me through and out of what might be these woods. I found myself wishing I had never played those games. I let the air escape slowly to give myself a last chance to use it in case I changed my mind and wanted to yell. I didn't. I would have to find my own way. I didn't know which way to go, so I just picked a direction and began walking. I walked for what felt like hours. I tried to walk in a straight line, but there was no path to follow. I made sure to course correct when I had to take detours around tree limbs that were too entwined to move through or patches of thorns that were too broad to step over. Every time I would make my way past one of these natural obstacles, I would be confronted with a seemingly identical tapestry of foliage, and the feeling of hopelessness would begin to assert itself a little more. I just wanted to see something familiar, and each time the woods appeared particularly thick, I thought I had found my landmark. Marking the outer edge of my usual explorations, there was an enormous pile of discarded and decaying Christmas trees that my best friend Josh had found once during a game of hide-and-seek. Although he had been driven out of its concealing shelter fairly quickly by fire ants, we would return to it many times to trample on the stray and spherical-colored ornaments that had been left behind. We had many stories about where the trees had all come from, but I assume now that the genesis of the pile was much more ordinary than what we had hypothesized. Whatever the origins, what was left was a tangled mass of still decorated, however sparsely, holiday trees that looked, from a distance, to be a single colossal Christmas tree. This would be the easiest thing to spot in my woods, and if I found it, I would know where I was. But that was only if these were my woods. As I stepped delicately through the brush, an idea began to form in my mind. If I could climb a tree, I might be able to see my way to the wood's exit. I became less despondent and began searching the canopy for a proper scouting position. None of these trees seemed tall enough, but if I could find one that was, I might be able to see a house. I might even be able to see my house, I thought. I stood still and balanced carefully on my now aching feet. The trees that loomed over me when I had woken up in these woods had been tall, I recalled. But I struggled to remember just how tall they were. What about the branches? I mumbled to myself. I remembered seeing branches above me, and if they grew low enough, I knew that I would be able to climb up the tree. If I could find my way back to that spot, I could work my way up the tree and possibly see a way out, but that would mean going back. I shifted on my feet and tried to make the best decision. Turning around, I took a few steps back toward the direction from which I had come, and I froze as a phrase echoed in my head, "How far can you go into the woods?" I hadn't been tortured by this question for well over a year, and I stood there a bit bewildered by the fact that it had suddenly come rushing back into my mind. On an afternoon, toward the beginning of kindergarten, I had come home from exploring a part of the woods that I had never seen before. I was excited to tell my mother how far I had gone, and she seemed, even if she was only humoring me, to be equally excited to hear it. When I had finished describing my journey, she congratulated me and asked if I thought I had finally seen all the woods there were in our neighborhood. I told her that I didn't think so, but that I wanted to. She smiled as she asked, "So, how far can you go into the woods?" This sounded like a challenge, and so I answered confidently, but none of my answers seemed satisfactory to her. Really far, super far, and even all the way were all rejected as viable responses. After each attempt to close the issue, she would just return with the same question, becoming more amused by the minute. At a loss, and wanting to be able to answer her question so that she would stop asking it, I asked the only other authority figure I knew, my teacher. She gave me a quizzical look and asked me what I meant. I didn't even really know what I meant, and so I just repeated the question. She thought for a moment and said, "I don't know, let's see," as she walked me over to the map that was tacked to our classroom wall. She asked me the name of my street, which I had memorized, and she took a moment to find it before touching my shoulder and holding her finger on a big patch of green. "I think these are your woods," she said. I repeated my question yet again, I told her that my mom had been asking me this question repeatedly. As I told my teacher this, she seemed to realize something and took her finger off the map. She smiled coyly saying, "I don't know. How far can you go into the woods?" As I stood there in the woods with my arms tucked inside my shirt to avoid the frigid air, I thought about this question and remembered how I came across the answer. This stirred a warm fondness in me that almost made me forget about the reason that question had come back into my mind to begin with. I discovered the answer just a few weeks after I asked my teacher. My grandparents called to chat with my mother and me, and when my mom handed me the phone to talk to my grandfather, Pop, I thought I could have a little fun and be on the giving end of the antagonizing for once. Before he could even ask me how I'd been, I charged at him. "Hi, Pop. How far can you go into the woods?" "What? How far can you go into the woods?" I repeated knowingly, although I knew nothing at all. "Oh. Well, I suppose about halfway," he said, snickering. "What? How come you could only go halfway?" And then, as if he had been waiting for this moment for his entire life, he bellowed, "Because if I went any farther, I'd be coming out." He began laughing so hard that it transformed into a coughing fit, and he handed the phone off to my grandmother. It took me a while to appreciate the nature of the question and its answer. I had never heard a riddle before, but the more I thought about it, the more I liked it. I would ask that question to dozens of people in the months to follow. Standing there barefoot in the woods, thinking about this riddle, I found that it wasn't amusing anymore. However, now it was more than just a silly question. I had walked a long way, for all I knew I couldn't walk any farther in, the last tree might be just ahead. If I turned back now, I might be walking back into the woods rather than out of them. I pivoted where I stood and resumed the trajectory that I had adopted when I set out. Everything was eerily quiet as I pressed on. The only noticeable sounds were of crickets, cicadas, and the light grinding of leaves under my sore feet. Occasionally, however, I would step too hard on a healthy stick, and its cracking would drive the noisy creatures to silence. I would stand there paralyzed by the sudden hush, and I would hold my breath and listen for sounds I hoped not to hear. When the insects resumed, so would I, desperate to keep their noise. I trod carefully on the undergrowth, but it was thick, and here and there my foot would press down on a stick just enough to snap it. The bugs would arrest, and so would I. This relationship persisted until the last interlude that I remember. I broke a stick, the insects hushed themselves, but instead of the expected silence, I heard what sounded like an infant crying in the distance. I could feel the blood draining out of my limbs as I listened to this wailing that didn't sound as far in the distance as I wished it to be. I felt a churning in my stomach and a weakness in my legs. Standing completely still and being careful not to make any noise, I waited. But the sound didn't stop. Suddenly, another sound joined the chorus. A large stick snapped just behind me. I panicked. I think now, as an adult, the sound I heard that night was a cat in either heat or rage, but I had no thoughts in my mind as I ran veering in different directions, taking as much care as I could to avoid big thickets of bushes and collapsed trees. I was paying close attention to where I stepped, because my feet were in such bad shape, and I suppose I instinctively wagered that it would be better to move less quickly than not at all. I paid too much attention to where I was stepping and not enough attention to where those steps were leading, because not long after hearing the cry, I saw something that filled me with such despair that I find it difficult to articulate its potency even now. It was the pool float. I was right back where I had woken up. I stood there dazed, staring at the pool float. It looked oddly familiar to me now that the initial mental haze that had plagued me when I first awoke had dissipated. I wondered if that was because it was the only thing in the woods that I actually recognized, but that didn't seem quite right. I shook it off and attended to what really mattered. I had traveled for what felt like a great distance, but I hadn't really moved at all. This wasn't magic or some supernatural folding of space. I was lost, utterly and completely. Up until that moment, perhaps in an effort to focus on what I could control, I had thought more about getting out of the woods than how I got in, but being back at the beginning caused my mind to swim. My feet had not hurt at first, but they were agonized now, and I had made not even an inch of progress. I had been hoping that these were my woods from the time that I had awoken in them. I had hoped that I simply didn't recognize them due to the obscuring and distorting darkness. But my optimism had long since disappeared, swallowed like everything else by the engulfing blackness. Had I run in a huge circle around that spot, or did I just get turned around and start making my way back? I realized that even if I set out again on the path I had tried to follow at the outset, there was no way to be sure I would actually chart the same course, and if I took a completely different course, then I wouldn't have even made progress in terms of scouting the area through my original excursion. And although I had pushed it to the very back of my mind, rhythmically, like a metronome, my mother's riddle marched back to the front lines, its footsteps faint at first but gradually building in a crescendo that became so loud I could think of nothing else, into the woods. As this echoed through my thoughts, I suddenly pictured the woods as a vast circle of trees. As I turned on the spot on which I stood and looked around me, a fear crept into my mind that I might be standing at the very edge of the circle and that whatever direction I picked would just lead me deeper, farther into the woods. As I continued scanning the landscape around me, my eyes fixated on one of the trees that I had seen towering above me when I first woke up. I looked at it dully, the way you gaze at something when you aren't actually seeing it, despite how unshakably fixed your eyes have become, like staring at a wall when you're lost in thought. Slowly, both my eyes and mind regained their focus, and I moved my head up. It was tall. I forced the despair out of myself and made my way to the tree, being careful to avoid the thorns that were blanketing the ground. As I stood on the exposed roots of the tree and looked straight up the height of its trunk, I thought that the tree must surely be tall enough to allow me to see my way out. I reached my hand up and grasped the lowest limb, but as I tightened my grip, my arm began shaking. Trying to steady myself, I moved my other hand up onto the branch, but when I tried to pull myself up, I felt my body protest. I remember thinking that night that it was simply too cold to climb the tree, but I know it wasn't the cold that stopped me. It was fear. I released the branch and looked back to the spot where my night had started. I could still see the place where I had woken up. It was a relatively clear spot in the middle of an otherwise debris-laced ground, as if I had tried to make a snow angel in the dirt and had given up in the middle of the project. It was a strange sight, but not any stranger than the rest of this place. Fully conscious of my feet's condition, I walked back to the small clearing and sat down with my legs crossed. What if there's no way out? I questioned, torturously. I was too defeated to feel anything but apathy, and I turned my attention back to the tall tree and the stars above, looking upon it all with listlessness. Tracing my eyes over the stars, I had an epiphany. I had heard so much about explorers navigating the world by sea, traveling to undiscovered lands and building new civilizations. I had learned that they could do this by following the stars, and my spirits rose in a flash as I realized that I might be able to do the same. At the time, I thought the North Star was just the brightest star, and so I looked for and found the one with the most brilliant shimmer. I followed it. I was careful to keep the star that I picked in my sights at all times. If I reached a point where the trees above obscured it too much or for too long, I redirected myself on a path that avoided them. I ignored every sound that tempted me to whip my body around to confront it, and despite the pain, I surveyed the ground primarily by the feel of my feet rather than the sight of my eyes, knowing that if this star was lost so too would be my way. Eventually my surroundings began to look more familiar, a network of fallen trees that I recognized as ones that I had used as balance beams offered my first legitimate sign of hope, though I walked around and not across them this time. Soon after, I came upon the Christmas tree pile, its scattered ornaments glimmering dimly in the weak moonlight. I gave it a wide berth to avoid the glass shards that might still pepper the ground from the times that my feet, when they were less vulnerable, had pressed down upon the glass balls of holiday flair and crushed them. My nerves were beginning to calm, and when I saw a dirt void called the ditch, I knew that I had made it out. The feeling of relief that washed over me brought with it a smile that was more sincere and joyful than any I had ever worn on my face before. Despite the impulse to quicken my pace when I had my bearings restored and no longer had to watch my North Star so vigilantly, my feet were in so much pain that I had to be mindful of each step. A distance I had covered in mere seconds in my nightly exodus from these woods seemed to be never-ending. I walked with a limp in both legs in an attempt to avoid putting too much weight on either foot. But when I saw the edge of the wood's dirt floor cut off by the paved cul-de-sac of my street, I grew so happy to be so close to home that I broke into a light jog, despite how much it hurt. When I actually saw the roof of my house over a lower-set neighboring house, I let out a light sob and ran faster, wincing with each step. I just wanted to be home. I had already decided that I wouldn't say anything about any of this to my mother because I had no idea what I could possibly say. I would get back inside somehow, clean up, and get in bed. If I were lucky, she would never even have to know about my odyssey. Anything that I might say would sound preposterous, and the thought of this whole experience reaching its end strengthened my resolve to leave it in the past forever once I finally shut that door behind me. However, my heart sank as I rounded the corner and my home came fully into view. Every light in the house was on. I knew my mom was awake, and I knew I would have to explain, or at least try to explain, where I had been, and I couldn't figure out where to start. My run became a jog, which became a walk. I ducked under the lowest branch of a large pine tree that stood outside our property, and carefully lifted the metal latch to the gate on the chain-link fence that enclosed our backyard. Slowly, I pushed open the gate in an effort to quiet the squeaking hinges. In about 15 seconds, I would knock on my back door and attempt to explain myself, but I was still reflexively trying to avoid being caught. I saw my mother's silhouette through the blinds, and although I was worried about how to explain things to her, it suddenly didn't matter to me anymore. I was home, it was over. I walked up the couple of steps to the porch and put my hand on the doorknob. I turned it thinking that it might be unlocked since my mother was awake. There was no sense in delaying the inevitable. There was no reason to knock. It turned the full motion, and I felt a mixture of both relief and apprehension. I was just about to push the door open when two arms wrapped around me and pulled me back, away from the door. This couldn't be happening. I had evaded and outran my imaginary pursuers countless times in my nightly scramble from the woods, but this wasn't imaginary. I looked at the silhouette in the window and tried to reach out. The arms constricted around my chest and lifted me off the ground while I struggled against them. I looked down at the appendages that had ensnared me. They were small, but there was something covering them. It looked like fur. I squeezed my eyes tightly shut. This can't be happening. My mind roared. The monsters were just pretend. I opened my eyes again and looked at the arms that were crossed over my torso. It was fabric, not fur, but this brought no real comfort. I was still being restrained. I still needed to get free. I screamed as loudly as I could, "Mom. Help me. Please. Mom." The feeling of being so close to safety only to be physically pulled away from it filled me with a kind of dread that is, even after all these years, indescribable. The door I had been torn away from opened, and a flash of hope shot through my heart. But it wasn't my mom. It was a man, and he was enormous. I thrashed violently and kicked at the shins of the person holding me. But even if I succeeded in escaping my captor, I knew that I would also have to get away from the person who had just come out of my house, this hulking figure who was now steadily approaching me. He reached his hand out for me, and it extended out of the shadow that had been cast on him by the porch light just above his head. It was a cruel and cracked claw, badly burned, with the consistency of a plastic bag that had melted and cooled. Up until that moment, I had never imagined that I could be in any legitimate danger from which my mother could not rescue me. But as I watched the man close the distance between us, and as I felt my captor's grip grow ever tighter, my fear was joined with rage. My mother simply could not be gone. Let me go. Where is she? Where's my mom? What did you do to her? As my throat stung from screaming and I was drawing in another breath, I became aware of a sound that had been present for longer than I had perceived it. Honey, please calm down. I've got you. It sounded like my mom. The arms loosened and set me down, and as the man who had been approaching me leaned down and put his hand on my shoulder, he eclipsed the porch light with his head, allowing me to see more than just his frame. He was a large man, with a tremendous burn scar on his left arm. I broke my eyes away from it and moved them up to his badge. He was a police officer. I turned to face the voice behind me with hope that was still tempered by fear. It really was my mom. The dark brown curls of her hair brushed my face as she knelt down to embrace me. I was finally safe. Tears started flowing down my face, and I sobbed heavily while the three of us went inside. The back door opened to a narrow hallway. On the right was a door that opened to a bathroom, which was connected to my room via another door. There was a faint smell of mildew that emanated from the bathroom. Nightmares of villains and ghouls that hid in my bathroom meant that I would never draw the curtain closed when I wasn't in the shower, and would only mostly draw it closed when I was. Because of this, water collected in its folds and filled that whole area of the house with the faint smell of watery rot. To the left were our washing machine and dryer. My cat was sitting on top of the dryer, and I gave him an absent stroke as I walked past and turned left toward the dining room. We sat at a table that my mother and I used as a dining area when we ate and a workstation when I had school projects. It was a fairly large, square table that had been painted white, but there were several spots where daily use had started to chip the white paint away, revealing layers of different colors on top of the original coat, whatever that might have been. One area looked almost like a cross-section of a jawbreaker candy, with its concentric and rainbow-colored rings, though my idle or nervous hands had helped along that more excavated section whenever I sat at the table to do homework or have a serious talk with my mother. Historically, the more nervous I was, the more frantically I dug. I learned that night that the first coat of paint was yellow. I'm so glad you're home, sweetie. I was worried I'd never see you again. She had begun to cry as well. Where did you go? I don't know. I don't know what happened. My fear of the whole event being ineffable was coming true. What do you mean you don't know what happened? Where have you been? Oh, look at you. You're filthy. She surveyed me now that we were in better light. Oh God. Your feet. I looked down and winced. The tops of my feet were caked in a thick, dark coat of my own blood that had already begun to crack with the pattern of damaged glass. As I moved my feet against the linoleum, I could feel that the blood was acting as an adhesive, and I could hear the sound of my skin peeling free from the floor as I lifted them. You went into the woods. Baby, we've talked about this. I can't believe you. Mom, I didn't. I don't know what happened. I protested. This was quickly becoming an argument, and neither my mother nor I was feeling up to it. It's okay. It's fine, honey. Just don't ever do this again, okay? I'm not sure me or my shins could take it. A little laughter broke through my sobs, and I smiled a bit. Well, I'm sorry for kicking you, but why'd you have to grab me like that? I was just afraid that you'd run away again. You had just come home, I wasn't about to let you run off again after what you wrote. I was confused. What do you mean? We found the note you left on your pillow, she said, and pointed at the piece of paper that the police officer was sliding across the table. I picked up the note and started to read it as my mother and the police officer walked into the kitchen. The note said that I was unhappy and that I never wanted to see her or any of my friends again. It was a running away letter. While the policeman exchanged a few words with my mom, I stared at the letter. I didn't remember writing any letter. I didn't remember anything about any of this. But there were many times when I would do things at night that I couldn't recall. I kept reading the letter as I thought about how I would sometimes use the bathroom without remembering getting up, or would wake up and be so tired that I didn't remember the ride to school. But this was different. This was wrong. Even if I sometimes went to the bathroom at night and didn't remember, or even if I could have gone into the woods on my own and gotten lost, even if all these things were true, one thought repeated endlessly in the background of all the other questions and doubts that filled my mind. This isn't how you spell my name. I didn't write this letter. Chapter 3, Balloons. When I was 5 years old, I went to an elementary school that, from what I've come to understand, was really adamant about learning through activity. The school was part of a new program designed to allow children to rise at their own pace, and to facilitate this, the administration encouraged teachers to come up with inventive and engaging lesson plans. Part of the underlying rationale, I think, was that if the teachers could trick the students into forgetting that they were at school, or that they were doing homework, the students would be more enthusiastic about their work. Moreover, if the students cultivated an eagerness for school right out of the gate, then the general apathy that has its way of creeping into most students as the years go by could be staved off. To this end, each teacher was given the latitude to create his or her own themes that would run for the duration of the grade, and all the lessons in math, reading, etc., would be designed in the spirit of the theme. These themes were called groups. There was a space group, a sea group, an earth group, and the group I was in, community. Regardless of the creativity of the curriculum, in kindergarten in the United States, aside from very basic writing skills, you don't learn much except how to tie your shoes and how to share, and as a result of that, most of the grade isn't very memorable. This is particularly true if you enter kindergarten with most of the writing skills that they expect you develop by the time you have exited. As one of the students who was in this position, I find that as I look back now, I remember the people fairly well, but the actual curriculum remains mostly a mystery to me. But perhaps this isn't all that unusual. I do remember two things very clearly. I was the best at writing my name in the correct way, which I had mastered some time before entering the grade, and the balloon project, which was really the hallmark of the community group, since it was a clever way to show how a community functioned at a very basic level. The concept of the balloon project was fairly straightforward. Each student would release a balloon with a note attached, and then would wait for a response from whoever happened to find the balloon. We would ask them to enclose a picture of their area, if possible, and provide a return address so we could become pen pals. The teacher would post each picture on a large map that she had hung on one of the walls in the classroom, and this would help us see not merely how far the balloon had traveled, but how important communication was in bringing a community together. I remember our project being on a Friday because the culmination of weeks of discussion and preparation for this exciting event made it feel as if I was having a 3-day weekend. The rocky start with which I had begun kindergarten had finally smoothed, and I talked excitedly with my friend Josh each day as we eagerly awaited the Friday launch. The morning of the launch, all the students walked into the classroom and saw that there was a fully inflated helium balloon tied off with ribbon taped to each desk. Our tables were laid out in a grid, and so the balloons had the same arrangement as planted trees in a lot. From the right angle they would all line up, but if you moved just a little to your left or right, they would fan out, and you could see them all again. We had known about this project since the first week of class, so we had known, at least abstractly, what to expect on Balloon Day. Despite this foreknowledge, however, walking into a classroom full of balloons gave the room the same ambience as that of a birthday party, and in response, the kids behaved as if it were one. The balloons were all different colors, and upon seeing this, the students began bartering heatedly with one another for their favorite colors almost immediately. It took the teacher much longer than normal to organize and stifle the students, but gradually we were subdued at our desks and were asked to take out our assignments for that day. The preceding Friday, the teacher had sent us home with instructions to write a note with our parents' assistance. All of the notes had to follow a loose structure, but we were allowed to be creative within those boundaries. My note read something like this. Hi. You found my balloon. My name is blank and I attend blank elementary school. You can keep the balloon, but I hope you write me back. I like Mighty Max, exploring, building forts, swimming, and friends. What do you like? Write me back soon. Here is $1 for the mail. At the bottom of the page, I drew a little stick figure saying, "Hi," in a word bubble next to his head, and after a few moments of consideration, I drew a balloon in his hand. On the $1 that I brought from home, I had written, "for stamps," right across the front, which my mom said was unnecessary, but I thought it was genius, so I did it. Sitting on each of our desks was a marker, a pen, a piece of paper, and an envelope. The first part of the project for that day was to transcribe the notes we had composed at home, after which we would put it in the envelope and attach it to the balloon. If we wanted to, we could draw a picture on it. There was a palette of paint with some brushes and cups of water sitting on a long table just in front of the teacher's desk for the kids who elected to paint a picture on their note. It was a sunny day, and those who wished to paint on their note were told to finish by a certain time so the letters could be set out to dry in the sun. Only a handful of kids were brave enough to send their art out into the world. After the teacher had finished giving us our instructions, most of my peers resumed their rowdy attempt at trading balloons while the teacher began assisting the few students who had forgotten to bring their letters to class. As for me, I started on my note immediately because I didn't want it to be sloppy. My handwriting, at least back then, was quite nice. With the guidance of my mother, I had been practicing writing while simultaneously learning how to read for a fair amount of time before I had begun kindergarten. Since the letter was already written, all that was left for me to do was copy it down verbatim. I had broken my left arm some weeks before, so the plaster cast made it difficult to reposition and steady the paper as I went, but finally I simply laid the heavy arm on the paper, leaned on it, and began transcribing, feeling thankful that I was right-handed. I took care with each stroke of the pen because I knew that I wouldn't be able to erase. I had never written anything important in pen before. Everything of any consequence that I had ever marked on a page was only as permanent as I wanted it to be. But now, each straight or curved line I marred the paper with had a tint of finality in it, and this only served to threaten the stability of my penmanship even more. But this was the way it had to be. Several years before, when the students were still writing their notes in pencil, there had been a storm the day after the balloons were released. Virtually no letters were mailed back. Although there was no way to determine exactly why that had been, it was suggested that the pencil marks washed out much too easily, and so to be safe, we should use ink from that point on. I drew the last line on the paper and sat back with satisfaction. I interrupted my teacher's conference with another student to show her the letter, and she approved enthusiastically and sent me back to my seat. With my remaining time, I took to decorating the balloon. Mine was red, and that suited me just fine. With no interest in trading my balloon for another color, I tried to think of what I could draw on it. I decided that Spider-Man would make the most sense. I got to work and spent about 2 minutes trying to figure out how to draw Spider-Man's head before I realized that it was impossible. Deciding that a plain balloon was actually better than one with a drawing on it, I put the marker away and went to talk to my best friend Josh. It usually took him a little longer to write things because he was left-handed and would occasionally smudge what he had just written as his hand moved against the paper from left to right. I went over to him that day, partially to help him, but mostly because I wanted to invite him to my house after school for what would have been our first sleepover. When the teacher told us to return to our desks, I walked back but froze as my letter came into view. It was wet. I looked around to see if someone might betray himself by laughing, but all of my peers were sitting attentively at their desks now. I craned my neck over their workspaces and saw that quite a few kids had painted pictures. I realized that someone who must have been trying to dry a paintbrush had carelessly sprinkled water droplets onto my note. The ink had already begun to run in outward arcs where the water touched it. The letter was still legible in parts, but some words were nearly obliterated. Others were simply incomprehensible. Rather than being a fan of exploring, according to my letter, I was an avid exploring enthusiast. I wanted to know who did this. I felt that I had put more effort into writing that letter than any of my peers, and so for someone to so carelessly deface it was unthinkable. But there were so many kids who had painted pictures on their notes that it would take too long to attempt to figure out who might have vandalized my letter. Attempting to repair, or at least minimize, the damage seemed more pressing. There was no time to recreate the letter in its entirety. I thought about rewriting just the damaged parts, but if I crossed them out and tried again, my pen pal would think that I didn't know how to spell. I reassured myself that there would be other letters and other chances and walked quickly to the table where the paints were. I tore off a paper towel and tried to dry off the note as best as I could without smearing the reanimated ink. The teacher called us alphabetically to the far side of the classroom. One by one, we stood in front of a wall-sized map of the city and smiled with our balloon tethers held tightly in our fists. The mechanical whirring of the Polaroid camera repeated as each of us had our picture taken. After the film had developed, we put the photographs in our envelopes along with our letters. The teacher handed each of us another letter to enclose, which I imagine explained the nature of the project while also expressing appreciation for their participation in it. The pen pals would have been provided with the mailing address of the school and asked to mail their letters promptly so that the project could progress. That was the whole project. Doing these simple things would allow us to build a sense of community without having to leave the school, and do it safely. We would also practice our reading and writing through our correspondences without even realizing we were doing schoolwork. Everyone, faculty and students alike, loved this project, and it had been a huge success every year, with the exception of the year it stormed. We marched single file out of the back door of the classroom and into the courtyard outside. Keeping our formation, we pressed our backs against the wall of the building so that we could pose for a group photograph. One of the students, a boy named Chris, had become so excited upon exiting the classroom that, as soon as he saw the sky above, he let his balloon go and started cheering. I think this enthusiasm would have spread quickly if the teacher had been a little slower in scolding him. "Now you're going to be the only one in the picture without a balloon, Chris," she snapped. The boy started to cry. He had a sore throat, so his complaints were hoarse and raspy. I remember thinking that he sounded funny, and I suppose there's some justice in the fact that I caught his sore throat a couple days later. I would like to say that in a demonstration of solidarity at least one other student let a balloon go, or even better, that we all let ours go and stood by Chris, balloonless and proud. But this was kindergarten. Most of the kids stood there with restrained amusement, while others advertised just how funny they found Chris' plight. In the end, Chris sulked at the very edge of the group picture and held his left hand out of frame, clutching an imaginary balloon with a frown etched so firmly in his face that it seemed like it might just outlast the lifetime of the picture that he was posing for. After the photo was taken, we formed a circle around the teacher who said a few things about friendship and community that I imagine went mostly unheard by the students whose attention was now myopically focused on loosening the grip on their balloon's tethers. When her speech was finally over, the countdown began. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.5. There was a collective groan in protest. She did this frequently. Although we didn't know what this number was, we knew that it was a way of stalling. 1. All at once, each kid yelled whatever their chosen launch word was, and the courtyard became a carnival as 24 brightly colored floating balls filled the sky. We ran chasing our balloons and tried desperately to distinguish them from other ones of the same color. Crosscurrents and updrafts flung the balloons wildly in different directions, and their human counterparts mirrored their movements on the ground below. Several kids collided with one another as they ran frantically chasing their balloons, but instead of fights, there were laughs. Despite the ruckus, I heard a rogue blast OFF, and shot my eyes down from the sky to see Chris releasing a bright green balloon that the teacher had just given him so that he could participate. As the balloons reached ever upwards, it became almost impossible to track my own balloon, and this brought with it a new kind of excitement. Where would it go? Who would find it? I remember that day so clearly. When I think about it, I can almost feel a phantom sun on my face and can sometimes, just faintly, smell my teacher's perfume. It was one of the happiest days that I had ever had. Over the next couple of weeks, the letters started to roll in. Most of the notes came, as requested, with pictures of different landmarks, and the teacher would pin each picture on the big wall map that we had taken our Polaroids in front of. Arranging them directly on the map made it easy to see where the letter had come from and just how far the balloon had traveled. We did this at the very beginning of class each day, which was a really smart idea because we actually looked forward to coming to school to see if our letters had come in. For the duration of the year, we would have one day a week where we could write back to our pen pal, or another student's pen pal, in case our letter had not come in yet. Day after day, I arrived at school excited but left dejected at the fact that my letter hadn't arrived yet. There were other students who didn't receive letters either. Not every balloon would be found, and this was something the teacher had reminded us of frequently, but this fact didn't offer me any consolation. I worried that all my hard work would have been for nothing, and I started to resign myself to the idea that I would have to write to one of my peers' pen pals if I wanted to have anyone to write to at all. But then one day it came. My letter was one of the last to arrive. Upon entering the classroom, I looked at my desk and saw that, once again, there was no letter waiting for me, but as I sat down, the teacher approached me and asked me about the letter I had written. She asked me if I remembered what I had sent away with the balloon. I was a bit taken aback, but I told her about what I wrote, and about the dollar, and about the drawing. When I finished, she brought her hand from behind her back and said with a smile, "I think this is for you, then." I was delirious with excitement, and my confusion regarding her questions about the letter I had sent ended when I saw the envelope. On the back, right over the seal, there was a drawing of a stick figure holding a balloon, just like the one I had drawn. The letter really was for me. I must have looked ecstatic, because as I was about to open it, she put her hand on mine to stop me and said, "Please don't be upset." I didn't understand what she meant. Why would I be upset now that my letter had come? I was mystified that she would even know what was in the envelope, but of course, I know now that she had screened the contents to make sure there was nothing obscene. But sitting at that desk, I was baffled by her concern that I would be disappointed. My balloon hadn't gotten lost. The person who found it hadn't just thrown my letter away. All other possible details seemed negligible and insignificant to me. But when I opened the envelope, I understood her reaction. There was no letter. The only thing in the envelope was a Polaroid, but I couldn't make out what the image was. It looked like a patch of desert, but it was too blurry to decipher. It appeared as if the camera had been moved while the picture was being taken. I turned the Polaroid over, but there was nothing on the back. It was just a Polaroid and nothing more. There wasn't even a return address. I realized that I wouldn't be able to write back, and since there was no way to tell where the picture was taken, it couldn't even be placed anywhere on the map. Instead, my teacher tacked it on the side of the map next to the compass rose, out of the way, but still a part of the project. I was crushed. When I got home, my mom asked me how my day was, and so I told her. I told her I had gotten a letter from my pen pal, and she became visibly excited. I think she had always known that I might never get a response, and as time went on and my potential contact remained silent, her consolations shifted from optimism in possibility and potential to realism and acceptance. So, when I actually received something, she was both shocked and overjoyed for me since she knew how badly I had wanted someone to write me back. When I told her that there was no letter, only a Polaroid, she joked that maybe my pen pal had bad handwriting and was embarrassed after seeing how good mine was. I didn't think that this was actually the case. My letter had been damaged before it even touched the sky. But my mother's words always seemed to have the ability to make me feel better, so I accepted her rationale, and I felt happy that I had gotten anything at all. The school year pressed on, and the letters had stopped coming for nearly all of the other students. After all, you can only continue a written correspondence with a kindergartner for so long. This was expected by the teacher, and the lull was worked into the curriculum. Our Friday letter-writing sessions slowly morphed into other projects, and everyone, including myself, had lost interest in the letters almost completely. I still thought about the picture from time to time. In some way, I still felt as if I had been cheated, but then again, there were students who had received nothing at all because their balloons had apparently been lost or disregarded. Recognizing this, I realized that I would seem greedy to those kids, and so any time I felt compelled to complain, I would bite my tongue. Gradually, I internalized this pretended acceptance and simply moved on both in appearance and thought, until I got another envelope. My excitement was rejuvenated fully, and I secretly reveled in the fact that I had just gotten a letter while nearly all of the other pen pals had abandoned their involvement. Most of my classmates had written back and forth with their pen pals several times, and the ones who received nothing at all were probably the victims of bad weather and bad luck. The first envelope I had received, however, was tantamount to someone laughing in my face. It seemed as if someone had gone through just enough trouble to let me know that he didn't care. Holding the correspondence in my hand validated my objections to the original arrival. It made sense that I received another delivery. There had been nothing but a blurry picture in the first one. This was probably to make up for that. But again, there was no letter at all, just another picture. This one was more distinguishable, but not fully comprehensible. The camera was sharply angled toward the sky. The photograph caught the top corner of a building in the bottom left of the frame, but the rest of the image was distorted by a lens flare from the sun. I turned the Polaroid over, but again there was nothing written on the back. My teacher put her hand on my shoulder and said, "A picture's worth 1,000 words, right?" before walking away toward her desk. A picture's worth 1,000 words. I had never heard that said before, and I sat there for a while trying to decide if I believed it. Because the balloons didn't travel very far, and because they were all launched on the same day, the board became a bit cluttered fairly quickly. If a letter came in with a picture of a place that wasn't already overrepresented on the map, it would be displayed, but otherwise the correspondences were distributed to their recipients, so we could take them home as keepsakes of the project. A week or two before the school year ended, the remaining pictures were taken off the map and handed out to their owners. My best friend Josh took home the second highest number of pictures at the end of the year. His pen pal was very cooperative and sent him photographs from all around the neighboring city. Josh took home, I think, 4 Polaroids. I took home nearly 50. The envelopes had all been opened by the teacher, but after a while I had stopped even looking at the pictures. However, the photographs were, if nothing else, a collection, and so I saved them in one of my dresser drawers that housed my other collections. The problem with collections, I had found, was that either there was simply no way to gather all the things in a series because there was no end to it, or there would always be that last item that made your collection incomplete. In my mind, I suppose, the things in the collection weren't as valuable as the completeness of the collection itself. My drawer was a mausoleum of my incomplete collections of rocks, baseball cards, comic book cards, and little miniature baseball batting helmets that my mother and I would ceremoniously buy from a vending machine at Winn-Dixie after T-ball games. I put the photos in a box and slid it next to my baseball cards. With the school year over and summer break just beginning, I turned my attention to other things. For Christmas, midway through my year of kindergarten, my mom had gotten me a small snow cone machine. It didn't make very good snow cones, but the fact that I could make them at home now delighted both Josh and me. He came to covet the machine so much that his parents bought him a slightly nicer one for his birthday, toward the end of the school year. The snow cones produced by Josh's machine were much bigger and were made much faster than when we would use my machine. Several weeks into the summer break, we decided to take a break from exploring the woods. We would pool our resources and set up a snow cone stand to make money. We thought we would make a fortune selling snow cones at $1. Josh and I lived in different neighborhoods, so we had a conversation about where we would set up shop. As one might have expected, we both wanted to locate the business at our respective houses, so before we even had the cups for the shaved ice, we had our first disagreement. His neighborhood was a bit nicer than mine, but many of the older houses in my neighborhood had slightly larger yards, and as such, the people who actually cared for them had to be outside for longer amounts of time in order to do so. There were also simply more people in my neighborhood, since there were many houses that stood on fairly small plots of land, and the ongoing construction around where I lived meant that there were always people outside on the weekends. Josh rebutted by claiming that his neighborhood was nicer than mine was, and this was a thought that had never occurred to me before. I became indignant, and our capacities to engage in a civil and rational discussion became exhausted. Ultimately, I won by trumping all of Josh's legitimate reasons by exclaiming that it was my idea, and so we would do it at my house. The first weekend was a disaster. We had both used our machines before, but to be quite honest, we simply weren't very good snow cone producers. We had 2 bottles of syrup, cherry and cherry, so there wasn't to be much variety in terms of flavors. More to our detriment, we had never completely figured out how best to pour the syrup onto the ice, or how much to pour for that matter, so most of our customers had their hands covered in overflowing red dye when they squeezed the paper cups to take their snow cones away. We made about $6 and stopped for the day. We didn't fare much better the second weekend. Josh and I had gotten the hang of the syrup for the most part, but I had the idea that we should use crushed ice in the machines in order to make the snow cones more quickly, since I thought that smaller chunks of ice would shave faster. Instead, the crushed ice became jammed between the blades and the plastic rotor inside the machine and broke my snow cone maker immediately. This machine was one of the nicest things that I owned, and so I became flustered when I couldn't get it to work. I took the top off and looked inside. I could see the chunks of ice that were jamming the blades, and so I picked up the plastic case and banged it on the table a few times in an attempt to dislodge them. Looking up, I could see a potential customer coming. I needed to clear the jam quickly. Without thinking, I pushed my hand down into the cavity of the snow cone machine and began carefully wrestling the ice out of the space between the blades and the inside wall. I looked up again, and I recognized the person from the weekend before. Forgetting that Josh's machine was working fine, I turned my attention back to the problem so that I would be ready for our first return customer. I could feel the ice begin to give and pivot a little as the heat from my fingers melted it. I almost had the problem resolved when I heard Josh say, "Hey, what's this button do?" I looked over to Josh and saw that he had his finger on the start button of my machine. Reflexively, I yanked my hand out of my snow cone maker, my middle finger catching the blade on the way out. There was a period of just a few seconds where I thought that I had just scratched myself, but a thin red line soon began to quickly draw itself horizontally along the underside of my finger. I watched as that line widened and spread as blood began dripping from my hand. I shouted at Josh while he prepared a snow cone on his machine for our anticipated customer, and he said that he was only joking, that he wasn't really going to push the button. He looked genuinely remorseful from what I could tell, though he seemed to have a problem looking at my hand as he apologized. I think now that Josh had a fear of blood. Josh had already finished pouring the syrup before the customer got to the table, and he held it gingerly so that it wouldn't melt. Holding my finger with the opposite hand, I looked around for something to wrap it in. By the time the customer got to our stand, the blood had welled up in the tight fist that I was making around my finger and had begun dripping down my forearm. As Josh held the snow cone out to the man, I saw our patron's eyes dart back and forth from the cherry red ice to my blood-red hand. His expression changed from concern to amusement, and finally he said, "You boys sure have put a lot of yourself into the business." The man followed this exclamation with a guffaw so long and loud that I could still hear it when I went back into the house to show my mom what I had done to myself. When I got back outside, Josh said that the man had bought the snow cone. We decided to quit while we were ahead, so we packed up and went inside. It turned out that my machine wasn't irreparably damaged. Once the ice melted, the jam was cleared, and it began to work again without difficulty. This was good news, because business picked up the following weekend. Josh and I had taken a substantial break from our explorations in the woods due to a patch of trees that blocked our path, and during that hiatus I made a new sign that said in big, bold letters, "Free snow cones." Josh said matter-of-factly that we weren't just going to give snow cones away, and I laughed as I pointed at what I had written in faint pencil just under the advertisement. Just kidding. My neighbor, an elderly woman named Mrs. Maggie, was our first customer that day. She pretended to be outraged by our ruse but happily paid us. Before she left, she told us that she would look for us in the lake later that day if we decided to go swimming. We had many more customers that day, and they were all good sports about our trick, including the man who returned for a third time. We made $18 that day and a little bit less the following weekend. The fifth weekend would turn out to be our last day of business. My mom would take my snow cone machine away only a couple days later. When I protested, she told me that she didn't want me cutting my hand off, although I had injured myself weeks ago. Even at that age, I thought that this late reaction was bizarre. Because Josh and I both had a snow cone machine, we each had a separate stack of money that we put together into one pile, and we then split it evenly. When there was an odd number of bills, we would play paper, rock, scissors, to see who would get to keep the extra bill. We called this decision-making ritual, gaming. That day we had made a total of $17, primarily from the same people we had been selling to since we started our business. After we stopped selling for the day, Josh was divvying up the spoils, and as he paid out my fourth dollar, I was consumed by a feeling of profound bewilderment. The dollar said, "For stamps." I must have vocalized my surprise because Josh noticed my shock and asked if he had miscounted. "No. That dollar." "Josh, that's the dollar I sent." "What?" "That's the dollar, man. The one I sent." "What dollar? What are you talking about?" Seeing the dollar here in my hands befuddled me, and I struggled to compose myself so I could explain more clearly. "From the balloon. I sent it off with the balloon, remember? I put it in the envelope with my letter." Josh pondered this for a moment before deciding what this meant. "That's so cool," he shouted. As I thought about it, I came to agree. The idea that the dollar had made it right back to me after changing so many hands staggered me. I had no way of knowing how far the balloon had traveled, but whatever the distance had been, this was still amazing. Whoever found my balloon must have bought some stamps at the post office, and then slowly and incrementally the dollar had worked its way right back to me. I rushed inside to tell my mom, but my excitement coupled with her distraction from an in-progress phone call made my story incomprehensible to her, to the point that she responded simply by saying, "Oh wow. That's neat," just to placate me. Frustrated, I ran back outside and told Josh I had something to show him. We thundered up the steps to my front door and ran immediately to my room. I opened the collection drawer, took out the box of envelopes, and showed Josh some of the pictures. I started with the first picture, and we went through about 10 before he lost interest in looking at poorly angled and meaningless Polaroids. I grew irritated with his disinterest. My Penpal had sent these pictures and today, after countless transactions, the dollar he used to send the photographs had landed right back in my hand. This was almost too much for me to take in, the sheer improbability of it all. Even the most minor alteration would have changed things entirely. If Josh had paid the first dollar to himself, I probably would never have even noticed my returning, defaced currency. Josh, however, had become completely disengaged and asked if I wanted to go play in the ditch before his mom came to pick him up. I responded with a distracted and almost dismissive agreement as I shuffled through the envelopes. I'm not sure how the routine was born, but the ditch had become a battleground to Josh and me. Nearly every time we stepped into the ditch, one of us would lob a clod of dirt at the other, and this would catalyze a full-scale assault in both directions. It probably started with a single, playful toss of a dried mass of compacted dirt, but it became nearly impossible for us to step into that arena without almost instantly entering into a standoff. We enjoyed these battles so much and sought them out with such frequency that ditch became the ditch without us ever noticing. That day was no exception to the rule of combat, but the war game was persistently interrupted by rustling in the woods around us. We were used to these sounds. There were raccoons and stray cats that lived in the woods by my house, but there seemed to be a little too much noise coming from the forest floor for it to be caused by either of those things. As we continued our battle, we traded guesses at what the source of the ruckus was in an attempt to scare one another. Playing games like these gradually evolved into the games I would play by myself when exiting the woods as the sun rolled away. My last guess was that it was a mummy, but in the end Josh kept insisting that it was a robot because of the sounds that we heard. As we were leaving, I said that if it was a robot, it would have made much more noise, but Josh shook this off and became a little serious. He looked me right in the eyes and said, "You heard it, didn't you? It sounded like a robot. You heard it too, right?" I had heard it, and since it sounded mechanical, I agreed that it was probably a robot. It's only now, looking back, that I understand what we heard. When we got back to my house, Josh's mom was waiting for him at the dining room table with my mom. Josh told his mom about the robot, our moms laughed, and Josh went home. My mom and I ate dinner, and then I went to bed. I tried to sleep, but I was feeling restless. Josh might not have been interested in the photos, but after seeing that dollar, I could think of virtually nothing else. Before too long, I climbed down from the top bunk and took the box of envelopes out of my dresser drawer. I took out the first envelope, set it on the floor, and placed the blurry desert Polaroid that had been inside of it on top. I laid the second envelope right next to it and put the oddly angled Polaroid of a building's top corner over it. I did this with each picture until they formed a grid that was about 5 by 10. I was taught to always be careful with the things that I was collecting, even if I wasn't sure whether they were valuable or not. I realized that I hadn't actually looked at the majority of these pictures before. I may have paid them a passing glance when I opened the envelope to look for a letter, but upon being reliably disappointed, I would simply close the envelope and put it with the others. As I looked at them now, I noticed that the pictures gradually became more distinct. I scanned my eyes over the Polaroids. There was a tree with a bird on it, a speed limit sign, a power line, a group of people walking into some building. Right as my eyes were about to move on to the next photo in the sequence, they froze and focused on something that vexed me so powerfully that I can now, as I write this, distinctly remember feeling dizzy and capable of only a single, repeating thought. Why am I in this picture? In the photograph of the group of people entering the building, I saw myself holding hands with my mother in the very back of the crowd of people. We were at the very edge of the photo, but it was us. As my eyes swam over the sea of Polaroids, I became increasingly anxious. It was a really odd feeling. It wasn't fear, it was the feeling you get when you are in trouble. I'm not sure why I was flooded with that feeling, but there I sat, floundering in the distinct sense that I had done something wrong. This feeling only intensified as I finally managed to break my gaze and look at the rest of the pictures. I was in every photo. None of them were close shots. None of them were only of me. But I was in every single one of them, off to the side, in the back of a group, at the bottom of the frame. Some of the pictures had only the tiniest part of my face captured at the very edge of the photo, but nevertheless, I was there. I was always there. For a moment, I tried to imagine this whole thing as one tremendous coincidence, but I knew that it wasn't, and I sat there stunned. I didn't know what to do. Your mind works in funny ways as a kid. There was a large part of me that was afraid of getting in trouble simply for still being awake. I wanted to wake up my mother. I wanted to tell her that there was something wrong here. I wanted to run into her bedroom and throw the pictures onto her comforter and just shout, "Look," and have her hug me and tell me that everything was going to be fine, that I had nothing to be afraid of. But I just sat there with the looming feeling of having made some irreparable transgression. I decided that I would wait until the morning. The next day, my mom was off work and spent most of the morning cleaning up around the house. I stared blankly at the cartoons on the television and waited until I thought it was a good time to show her the Polaroids. When she went out to get the mail, I grabbed a couple of the pictures and put them on the table in front of me. I sat waiting for her to come back in. I couldn't even think of how to begin, and I dug my fingernails into the chipping paint on the table as I tried desperately to think of the perfect way to explain everything. When she returned, she was already opening the mail. I heard her throw some junk mail into the trash can, and I took a deep breath and forced words out of my mouth. "Mom, can you come here? I have these pictures, just give me a minute, honey. I need to mark these on the calendar." After a moment, she came and stood behind me and asked me what I needed. I could hear her shuffling with the mail, but I just looked at the Polaroids and told her about them. I reminded her about the balloon project and how I had only gotten a picture in my first correspondence. I told her that after that one they just kept coming, but I never said anything because they were just stupid pictures. I dug my fingernails harder into the table and told her that I had saved them all and had gotten so excited when the dollar came back that I stayed up late looking at all the photos. As I went on in my explanation and pointed to the pictures, her frequent ahas and okays decreased, and she was suddenly completely quiet and making only a little noise with the mail. I had run out of things to say, but I couldn't turn around and face her. I waited for her to say something, but the next noise I heard from her sounded as if she were trying to catch her breath in a room that had no air left in it. At last, she subdued her struggling gasps and simply dropped the remaining mail on the table right next to me and ran to the kitchen to get the cordless phone. "Mom! I'm sorry, I didn't know about these. Don't be mad at me." With the phone pressed to her ear, she was alternating running and walking back and forth while shouting into the mouthpiece. I couldn't understand what she was saying or who she could be calling. Was it my teacher? No, this wasn't her fault. I nervously fiddled with the mail that was sitting next to the Polaroids I had arranged. The top envelope had something sticking out of it that I thoughtlessly and anxiously pulled on until it came out. It was another Polaroid. Confused, I thought that somehow one of my Polaroids had slipped into the stack when she threw the mail down, but when I turned it over and looked at it, I realized that I had not seen this one before. It was me, but this one was a much closer shot. I was surrounded by trees and was smiling. But it wasn't just me. Josh was there too. I felt my mouth go dry as I realized that this was us from yesterday. I started yelling for my mom, who was still screaming into the phone. As I called to her more loudly, she shouted more loudly into the phone to compensate, and this exchange repeated until she finally responded with, "What?" Suddenly, I had her attention, but I didn't know what to do with it. I could only think to ask, "Who are you calling?" "I'm talking with the police, honey." "But why?" "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to do anything, please Mom." She answered me with a response that I never understood until I was forced to revisit these events from the earliest years of my life. She grabbed the envelope off the table, and the picture of Josh and I spun and slid, landing next to the other Polaroids in front of me. She held the front of the envelope up to my eyes, but I could only look at her and watch as all the color began draining out of her face, as if something was siphoning the life right out of her. With tears welling up in her eyes, she said that she had to call the police because there was no postmark.